Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this show, which is designed to give all of us a little better insight into the doings around our capital and the people who are involved in the political process. Our guest today is a gentleman who's been heavily involved in the political process for more than 2 decades, and he is a gentleman who is very knowledgeable about government from the inside as well as from the outside. It's Mark Nelson from Public Affairs Council.
Well, thank you, Kevin.
The whole process that we have here on Capital Insight is designed to just give us a chance to chat a little bit, but to learn a little bit more about people that are heavily involved in politics from the personal side, and then a little more information about you in terms of what you do politically. But on the personal side, can you tell us a little bit about where you hearken from and what your family's all about?
Oh, I grew up outside Milwaukee, Oregon, not Wisconsin, and my family lived up there, and I graduated from Milwaukee High School and went back to school in Chicago, and didn't quite finish there. I ended up in the service for a couple of years and then finished up at Southern Oregon and came up in 1973 to work for the legislature as a committee administrator. And I think I was the last committee administrator hired. And from that point, went on to work for State Treasurer Jim Redden.
So now you had already, we're pegging you a bit here. 73 is when you were first involved heavily in the legislative process?
Yes, yes.
And what kind of committee did you work for?
I had the House Transportation Committee. The Democrats had just taken control of the House for the first time in a number of years. And I had the House Transportation Committee, and then near the end of the session also took over the House General Government Committee because that administrator went on to another job.
Well, what drew you into politics at that point?
Oh, I've been involved in some campaigns in Southern Oregon, and I had 2 choices. One was to go to law school, and the other was to go to work for the legislature, and I chose the legislature, and glad I did.
Now, right after session, did you go to work for Jim Redden, or how did that work?
Yes, I got to, Jim had been elected state treasurer in 1973 and took office in 74. I had gotten to know him during that legislative session. We had some mutual friends, and he'd asked for some assistance, just pro bono, because he had no front office staff at that point in time other than the deputy state treasurer. So I did some work for him, and at the end of the session, he asked me to go work for him.
And sometimes we might say the rest is history, but actually Jim Redden then ran for Attorney General.
Yes, that's correct.
Did you work on his campaign?
Yes, remember you were in his office at that point in time. I think you'd been there a few years and as an assistant attorney general, and but I'd worked on his campaign for attorney general, and when he became attorney general, I came on as the executive assistant administrator in the office.
Now that's the first time that I met you. Of course, I was an assistant attorney general when you came in with Jim Redden. And I'm curious about the process at that time, because Jim seemed to understand that there was a political dynamic to the Department of Justice, too. It's not just a bunch of lawyers representing government agencies, but that the Attorney General has a public policy role to play, advising those agencies, working with the governor. How did that work for you? How did that process work out in the Attorney General's office?
I found it to be very, very special time, at least in my life. And part of that was Jim Redden, because he was a very, very special person, and still is. He's, as you know, a federal judge and just retired. But the intricacies of, as you say, public policy and advising state agencies as to what the law is. Many times you can have state agencies that want a particular question answered in a certain way, and I think Jim epitomized the need to have an attorney general who tells you what the law says, in other words, tells the agency what the law is and means, as opposed to tells the agency what they want to hear. It's a very, very important office in the state. I find it to be almost as important as the office of governor. It has such an impact on the daily lives of Oregonians, much more than anybody really realizes.
Well, in that role, working with the Attorney General, how did you feel when Jim Redden then was nominated to be a federal judge?
Well, I'd been with Jim in politics, of course, since '73, and And he and I were very, very close. And the fact that I think Jim Redden at that point in time in his career could have gone on to be anything he wanted, U.S. Senator or governor. He was liked that much on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat. So it was a disappointment when he decided to take the federal judgeship. At the same time, he was the kind of person which one of the reasons why he was so special. He couldn't stand to raise money for campaigns. He just hated to ask people for money, and which I understand is one of the more difficult parts of running a campaign, running an election. So I think for him, the law won out, and he had the opportunity to go back and practice law as a federal judge, and that was important.
Well, then what was the transition for you once Jim Redden went on to the federal bench? What did you head into?
Well, I of course had handled all his legislative affairs and administration, both as state treasurer and attorney general, and so my natural gravity was to go to be a lobbyist. And of course, I thought that, well, I had been a lobbyist for 6 years and 7 years in the private sector, that it would be very simple for me to just go to in the public sector, go to the private sector and say I'm a lobbyist today, and I would have all these clients. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. I was lucky in that I had a partner who knew a lot about public opinion survey research, and we had formed a partnership, and so I got to learn about polling, and the combination of having both polling and the lobbying, I think, is what caused us to survive for the first couple of years. So that's how I entered into the lobbying field.
So about what year was this when you opened up your
This was in
lobbying
1980. I had stayed on a couple more months to help the interim attorney general on the transition after Jim went to the federal bench, and then went to work initially on running a ballot measure campaign, which of course we also do as we run statewide ballot measure campaigns, and that was the second property tax limitation that had been proposed, and we were hired to run the opposition.
Well, let's pick up here then. In 1980, you're setting out as a lobbyist. It's been 16 years. You now run Public Affairs Council, which is a highly regarded, well-established firm that doesn't just lobby the legislature, but deals in the electoral process and politics. Can you describe the operation a bit to us as it is today?
Well, we represent 19 clients before the Oregon legislature, and they range from everything from more liberal kinds of clients like National Association of Social Workers, Head Start, Oregon Judges Association, Oregon Criminal Defense Lawyers Association, all the way over to more corporate business type, 7-Eleven, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, very controversial kinds of issues, as you know, Anheuser-Busch, Browning Ferris, a large waste management company. So a wide variety of spectrum, everything from very, very liberal issues to more conservative issues. Tied in with that is we also handle, again, statewide ballot measures. So as ballot measures are proposed, we will be hired either to oppose or to support ballot measures. Principally, those have been on the business side, although we've handled a lot of education, the anti-property tax limitation, a lot of school finance issues have been generally successful, except for we beat the property tax limitation 4 times. That's the good news. The bad news is we also handled it in 1990 and lost ballot measure 5.
Well, in this process, I'll take a little side detour for a moment and ask about ballot measure 5. The impression many of us have is that had the legislature addressed the issue of property taxes in some aggressive way and maintained a posture where citizens were getting some relief, we wouldn't have seen the much more draconian, much more dramatic changes brought about by Measure 5. Well, do you have a particular impression on that?
I think that's correct. I think we were successful 4 times in beating ballot measure 5, and sometimes by less than 2%. Each time it started 65% passing. The 5th time came around, and people, again, we were winning by just the narrowest of margins. The 5th time came around, we started again at 65%. We brought it down to about 52, 51. We couldn't push it over. And I think we made some mistakes. I'm going to say that also in the campaign. But I think it finally got to the point that where people said, I've had it, enough has not been done, I'm going to try it. Now, the legislature, I think, could have provided different and better relief than what came as a result of ballot measure 5, which in my mind was a meat axe approach to the problem, but and everyone's paid for it one way or another.
And to maintain this detour for one more question, and I'm not asking you to come up with a magic solution, but it's beginning to impress me that maybe now there's an opportunity in the next couple of years to put together an alternative to Measure 5 and go back to the voters to ask voters to address property tax limitations, which will be real and viable, but which won't take the meat axe approach. One reason being that we're now seeing that Measure 5 didn't deliver anyway in certain ways because it didn't deal with the assessed value of the property, it only dealt with the rate. Do you think the political climate has developed to the point where, and maybe it hasn't yet, but might develop to the point where we could go back and say, here's an alternative solution, let's move away from Measure 5 and come up with something else?
Oh, I think it is. It's there, but the big option has always been an issue of school finances. What's the alternative? And whose ox is being gored as a result of what you're proposing today versus what they have. The assessment issue is very, very real. Sizemore has another ballot measure out there which will try to cap those assessments. You know, I don't think that's the answer. At the same time, I don't see necessarily a solution coming forward. Oregonians have made it, in my mind, abundantly clear that they will not accept alternative revenue resources such as a sales tax. You know, the kind of polling we've done, they won't accept income tax increases. So the issue is, will we, under our existing income tax system and economy, if the economy continues to grow, develop the kind of income that is going to somehow can be used to offset local property taxes. But again, then we're right back into that situation where, you know, we're pouring money back into local government to get rid of or to lower the property tax. I'm not sure what the answer is, except for more money or less government.
What about a special limited homestead exemption for, say, seniors and for the disabled? That if you're disabled or you're over the age of, I'm making this up, say you're over the age of 60, that you would have, that your homestead could not have any increase in assessed value or no more than, say, a 3% increase in assessed value, no matter what the real assessment is, so that we could help out seniors and the disabled, the folks who are most upset about increases in property taxes, but then otherwise still allow the property tax system to carry on. Do you think there's any viability for that kind of a limited approach?
Well, I think obviously it would be viable to those people who are going to benefit. This is not the same proposal that we had in, I think it was 86, where we had 3 or 4 measures, one being a homestead exemption. But that one, as I remember, was not limited to just seniors. That went down by a fairly large amount. Now it's 8 years later, and people may have different ideas. It's obviously a partial split roll, and whether that brings out the business community who has a concern about setting up different kinds of property tax systems for different classes of property. As you know, they were part of the 1992 effort to defeat, and they did defeat that particular split roll. So I think it's good for seniors who probably need it in some cases more than others, and handicap. The issue is whether or not, you know, what happens with that shift.
Okay, well, we're going to pause for a moment. I'll mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, your host. Our guest is Mark Nelson, the Public Affairs Counsel. Mr. Nelson works in governmental affairs, both as to initiatives, elections, lobbying, and he has quite a company, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. If you ever have any questions or concerns, I'd invite you to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. We're always happy to hear from you and look forward to hearing from you. We'll pick up again on talking about initiatives on the whole process. What kind of a crew do you have available to you in your company now to work on these issues? Do you have one secretary, or do you have a large staff? I know the answer, but I want to hear the details.
Well, we have 10 full-time employees working at Public Affairs Council. In addition to that, we have probably anywhere from 30 to 35 permanent part-time interviewers that work on the polling side of the firm. We do a lot of public policy survey research for a variety of different groups, and school districts. We probably do more school district surveys on bond measures and community college job rating kinds of surveys, and everything from ballot measures to candidates to pipelines in Montana, and it's fairly varied. In addition to that, as we come up on the ballot measure season that we're doing now, we will then bring in addition to the permanent staffing that shift from some of the lobbying, which tends to decrease at this period of time, from the permanent staff that will work on ballot measures, we add to that staff people who have particular, especially field organizing skills. We'll bring them on a limited duration basis to work on the ballot measure campaigns.
Now, without violating any of your trade secrets, can you give us some notion of what you would do if you were organizing a support group for an initiative that is trying to get something on the ballot and then getting it passed once you have the signatures, just to give folks an understanding of that process?
Well, up to this point, we haven't gone into the signature gathering business, but generally speaking, if you're putting a measure on the ballot, you of course file it with the Secretary of State. You go through what's called the ballot title challenge process. This is where people comment on the ballot title, and eventually it goes, a title is given by the Attorney General, can be appealed to the Supreme Court. That can take anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks. Once that ballot title is certified, then you can begin to print petitions and as you know, and gather signatures, which must be filed by the first week of July prior to a general election. But from there, you have, of course, the whole campaign organizational point of view. Obviously, you have campaigns, whether you're opposing or supporting, that can be very broad in their grassroots appeal. In other words, you have a lot of people involved in the particular issue, or it could be very, very narrow kinds of interest in which you're dealing with certain types of business interests or certain types of special interests that are concerned with this particular piece of legislation. From our point of view, we develop a campaign plan which lays out usually 2 or 3 different optional budgets. Gets very specific in terms of survey research, work to be performed, who's going to do it, timelines. We lay out media plans, which television, radio, newspaper, when they're going to run, how many ads, that kind of thing, all set out on a schedule. We do a lot of personalized direct mail, not the typical graphic kind of direct mail, but more of it's a letter I write from me to you, typed envelope, and if you read your mail, you read this. And it's designed to take difficult issues and to break them down in a fashion in which you can explain it to people. So those things are all set out on timelines, and we try to build to a crescendo in the November election, which from my point of view, thank God we don't have vote by mail in this November, but that's another issue. It's all designed to bring the campaign to a point of support or a passage or defeat.
Now that's interesting when you mention vote by mail, because now I think what you just described gives everybody a better understanding of how you try to build up to a certain point with the campaign where the information is maximized, there's focus, and people can understand the issues and vote. With vote by mail, we have this greater opportunity to vote. It kind of has expanded, so you lose your focus point. Are you finding that folks out there in the electoral process are trying to adapt to that by hitting people earlier, or are they trying to pepper them with information throughout the process? Again, without violating any of your trade secrets, because, I mean, granted, your expertise is one of the things you sell to your clients, but generally speaking, how do you analyze that?
Well, the vote by mail is simply changing the date of the election and adding more opportunities to vote, okay? And in a typical election, we would start 4 weeks out from the November walk-in election, okay? So, November 10th, we're out there, or November 7th, we're out there, say, October 10th, running into the election. Okay. Now, vote by mail says we're going to mail those ballots out, and they're going to hit 3 weeks out. Okay. Now, we know from statistics that 40 to 60% of the people who are going to vote are going to vote in about the first week. Okay. So, what do we do as a campaign? Well, the real election day is really 3 weeks out, and into that next week. Okay? So now, my typical 4-week campaign has to back up from the 3rd week out to the 7th week. Okay? Now I've got a 7-week campaign. Okay? And this is why my major objection to vote by mail is it costs too much. It's about 60-70% increase in cost of elections.
Well, let me pause right there and say, isn't that interesting? Because one of the big reaction of voters is that they don't like the fact that the electoral process costs so much. Candidates have to pungle up so much money. But vote by mail, which everyone else also seems to be saying that they tend to like, is actually going to increase the cost of the electoral process.
Sure. Some of the major proponents of vote by mail are those people who say we're spending too much money in campaigns and we need campaign finance reform. Well, in fact, what they're proposing has, in my mind, and I think the data will bear it out, have increased the cost of campaigns anywhere 60 to 75%. Because like I say, now you got to start 7 weeks out rather than 4 weeks out. Okay? And you've got to run all your electronic media for those 4 weeks until that first vote. Okay? Just like you had did before, but now you're still 3 weeks out. Now, your electronic media can't differentiate between who's voted and who hasn't voted. Okay? So your television and radio has to continue those last 3 weeks. Ever diminishing rate of return because you have less and less people who haven't voted. Okay? Now you have a second element, a very costly element, is now you're going to go in and you're going to find out who hasn't voted. First you have to do voter ID to see how they were going to vote. Now you're going to go in and you're going to ask the elections official, print me a list of who hasn't voted each day. Okay? Now for the last 3 weeks, I have to go talk to every one of those people who haven't voted that my data says probably would vote with us. So your voter ID that some people do some of the time, and you're contacting those voters, has probably tripled in terms of the number that you have to do if you're going to do it right. All those add incredible cost to elections and to campaigns. So in my mind, beyond, I think there's some real philosophical issues involving walking and participating and getting into that ballot booth and voting, as we have done for hundreds of years. I think there's some real issues there, but beyond that, there's a real economic issue that's just, we're going the opposite direction.
Do you think the dust is settled now that Oregon has a law heading in that direction, or is it something that we might revisit?
Well, I strongly think that people should revisit it. I mean, you can't, on one hand, say you're going to limit campaign contributions from anybody in any PAC to $100. At the same time, say we're going to give you a system that costs you 75% more to run. I mean, it just means that the public is, in fact, less informed other than getting a ballot in front of them.
All right. Well, we're going to pause for a moment again and mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. I'm your host. Our guest today is Mark Nelson from Public Affairs Council. And again, if you have any questions or concerns, anything you'd like to contact me about, feel free to contact me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. We're always happy to hear from you. Returning to you, Mark, the electoral process, of course, doesn't just involve that May primary or November election. It also involves the follow-up with the legislature once they're elected and sworn in and all of that. And you also work heavily in that process as a lobbyist. Can you give us some idea of how you approach legislators, how you deal with them as a lobbyist and trying to deal with issues, any particular issue that you want to use as an example would be fine, or if you just want to talk generically. What do lobbyists do?
Well, I think everyone has the impression of lobbyists, which is that you have $100 bills dripping out of your pocket and people are picking them from you as you collect their opinion about a vote. And Oregon, and I think very few other states, that's certainly not the case. But the lobbyists perform a very real function, and that is they provide information on a variety of issues. You know, you look at 3,000 bills over a particular session, there is no way the legislature is going to understand all of the intricacies of every one of those bills. So what happens in the process is that I might represent National Association of Social Workers, and we have a lot of mental health providers. We probably provide 55% of the mental health care. So we're very concerned about Oregon Health Plan, for example, and whether there's going to be proper mental health coverage for people within the Oregon Health Plan. Well, there may be others who, such as in industry, who are concerned about the overall cost of health care and who believe mental health care costs too much, and they don't want that as part of a health insurance package. So there you have two different groups, okay? The process is that I come and set appointments with legislators, first who are on the various committees who are going to deal with those issues. I lay out our reasoning for why mental health should be part of a health insurance package. And I give stats that I have developed from national research and provided by me by my client, showing that the infusion of mental health care actually reduces overall medical cost. Okay? The other side comes in, sets their appointment, and says, well, over the last 10 years, and this is now, say, industry and business, we have seen an average of a 17.2% increase in health insurance cost. We believe that the addition of mental health will increase our overall health insurance costs by 8%. This is why we don't believe you should add mental health into coverage, into health insurance coverage. You and others as legislators have to sit there and weigh those two arguments presented and the data presented in those meetings and say, I agree with him, I agree with this person. And you make that choice. Now, lobbying isn't just that process. It's providing information and trying to get people to, of course, agree with you. It's also, it's a very technical kind of process. The Oregon legislature, like any other system, whether it's in government or corporations, has its procedures and its process. And quite honestly, many times procedurally, you can defeat legislation that may go down also because of its merits, but may also not go down as a result of its merits.
In other words, you try to work with legislators on the process side because, yes, things can be, say, killed in committee that you would like to just leave there and not have to go to the House floor or the Senate floor for a vote.
That's correct. I mean, you have some opportunities, some measures can go to one or two committees. It could go to one committee with a referral to another. You can make arguments, and keep in mind the other side's making arguments too. Why it should go to this committee, that committee may be more favorable to you than this committee, or why it should need to go to a second committee because it may have fiscal impact. The other side's making just the opposite kinds of arguments if they're doing their job. And so those decisions again are made, yes or no. And again, like you say, it goes to a committee. You can perhaps, convince the people in the committee that it should stay there, and then it doesn't reach the floor.
And that's part of the process then, that the committees do drive the legislative process because bills have to come to the committees and then the committees have to send them. Right. And if they don't send them, it's very hard otherwise to get it to the House or Senate floor.
And it's a very strong committee state, and your viewers may say, well, why shouldn't every measure get voted on the floor? Well, isn't this kind of a restrictive process? It really isn't, because it's the committee that takes all of that information. The entire body doesn't have the ability to hear all that information.
In fact, we couldn't be productive if we relied on the entire floor.
You literally could handle maybe only 10% of the bills you do now. So you leave it to a committee, but it's a very, very open process. Oregon is incredibly open in terms of, your neighbor down the street, they pick up the paper and they see that some bill is up that day. They can walk right down, put their name on a piece of paper, and they can be up in that witness stand that afternoon testifying on that bill.
And I'd add on that they can also walk into a legislator's office or call them up or write to them. And with that, I'd invite you to become involved in the legislative process anytime that you want to raise issues. And I hope that this Capital Insight gave you some insight into that process. Thank you for joining us.